Hi, everyone, and welcome. We will begin shortly. Just letting a couple of folks in, and then we can start. Hello, and welcome again to our Southeast Rural Housing Preservation Academy. Today is our fourth session on strategies for preservation. We do have an upcoming in-person session on financing in Atlanta, Georgia on June 15th. I will drop the registration link during the session. It is free, and it's from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. But before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping notes. Just be mindful that everyone who is registered will receive the slides via email. The session is also being recorded, and you will receive a copy along with the PowerPoint as well, and it will be posted to our website. We will answer questions throughout the presentation, so please submit all your questions using the Q&A or the chat or raise hand function. And also at the end, I will share a survey. So please tell us how we did in a survey at the end of the session. And now I will hand it to Robin Wolf, Director of Rural Housing, for a land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Adrienne. I would like to acknowledge that I live in Denver, Colorado, in the traditional lands of the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes, and pay my respect to the elders, both past and present, with an understanding that Native Americans have been mistreated in this place and across our continent. Despite the maltreatment and neglect that has persisted for generations, Native Americans have contributed so much to the fabric of our nation and our state. And I ask that we let this acknowledgement serve as an opening for greater awareness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, and as a step toward a more equitable relationship and reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. Please take a moment to consider the legacies of violence, displacement, and settlement that bring us together here today, and that we may embrace a new sense of connection, relation, and belonging to each other and to the spaces we occupy. It is our practice on the Tribal Nations and Rural Communities team that at Enterprise that we practice land acknowledgements as we actively work to rectify housing inequities for Indigenous peoples and other historically marginalized communities. That is part of where our mission and our vision at Enterprise. We are working to have a country where home and community are stepping stones to more, and to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. Again, I'm Robin Wolf. I'm the Director of Rural Housing here at Enterprise. Adrienne Norwood is my colleague who is helping with slides. Adrienne is our Senior Program Associate here on the Tribal Nations and Rural Communities team. Adrienne, next slide, please. At Enterprise, we develop and deploy programs, we advocate for policy, we invest capital in projects, and we own and operate 13,000 affordable homes and provide resident services for 23,000 folks across the country. And this is part of the Southeast Rural Preservation Academy. As Adrienne mentioned, we're well into our work here at the Preservation Academy this year, 2022. We have gone over rural rental housing preservation in the Southeast. We've provided an overview of USDA RD development housing in the 515, a bit about the 515 process. We have more to work on that. And today we're here with strategies for preservation, looking at case studies and learning from others who have gone through and worked on preservation deals about how preservation deals might be structured. As Adrienne mentioned, we will have a conversation on financing, funding the work, including philanthropic, CDFI, state, federal financing. That will all be part of our session on June 15th in person at the Loudermilk Center in Atlanta. Should you have questions or want to register, please reach out to us. The session will be free of charge, and we are really looking forward to having a lot of folks in attendance and learning about this together. It will be our first Rural Preservation Academy session in person since 2019. And of course, we need to recognize our partners who make this work possible and make these sessions possible. Truist is our banner sponsor here for the Southeast Rural Preservation Academy, and we're very appreciative of their support, but also the support of Georgia Power and Fannie Mae, who are working to continue this work here as we moved in the Southeast. And hopefully we'll get to hear from a lot of these folks also as presenters actually on the June 15th session. So that is where we are. With that, next slide, Adrian. I want to introduce John Toppin. John is the president of Tapestry Development Group, where he has the oversight and management of the development projects at Tapestry and specializes in permanent supportive housing and low-income housing tax credits. His current and past experience with project development also includes historic preservation, affordable housing preservation, and green building design, making him a great person to present today. John is a certified CPA in Virginia and held a variety of county roles prior to coming to Tapestry. So we're really excited. John's group at Tapestry has been part of the cohort, and we're really excited, John, to learn from you and learn from the case study that you're going to present today. So take it away. I will say, if you have questions, please submit them via chat or Q&A, and we'll make sure we get to those at the end of the session.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and thanks all for joining. And yeah, I'm both glad to present and share my experience, but also we'll have a lot to learn on the rural housing side. So I'm glad to be on both sides. So hopefully what I'm going to share helps advance everyone's knowledge and helps further discussion on how to preserve rural housing. So next slide, please. So yeah, as Robin said, Tapestry Development Group, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're based here in Decatur, Georgia, and have worked throughout the Southeast. I'm excited to report we just closed on a merger with an Alabama developer, so we will be doing a lot of Alabama work as well. So those are two states will be our main focus. We've done some work in South Carolina as well, and have a bunch of rural projects going in all three of those states. But this is one that's completed and I think touches on a lot of the different challenges and opportunities in preservation. So I'm going to go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about Village at BLACKSHEAR. That'll be kind of the main focus of my presentation. So you can see here, this is the Southeast. The Village of BLACKSHEAR is a rural property down in Southeast Georgia. It's down in a very small city called BLACKSHEAR. It is about population of about 3,000, 3,500. And we have a 64 unit project there that I'll talk about. So it's down by Waycross, which is about 18,000 people, I think. So other than that, it's a very sparsely populated part of the state. Next slide. So just kind of drilling down closer just to get a sense of the location of where it is. So this is Waycross is in the center there, and is definitely where a lot of their residents head down for shopping and medical care and all kinds of other stuff. So the BLACKSHEAR is the little city in the upper east and the upper right hand corner. So very small city. Next slide, please. So this is an aerial of it. So you can kind of see where this is the city of BLACKSHEAR. Our properties are the red dot on the left. So we are on the outskirts of town. That was intentional, that the low-income housing is on the edge of town. And it's it's still kind of undeveloped years later, mostly around it, but there are some single family homes, but we're still, as you can see, close to the main strip and the downtown activity there. It's a pretty healthy downtown. The economy is pretty strong, unlike a lot of the other cities around there. There's not a lot of vacancies and kind of a stable economy there. So one more slide showing the location of it. So this is an aerial we took upon completion of the project. And as you can see, it's still largely undeveloped around it. On the upper left side, there's a city park that is a nice amenity for our residents. But yeah, it's still mostly undeveloped around there. The property with the darker roofs are ours. We're kind of wrapped around a public housing authority project, which is kind of on the top end, which has some of the lighter roofs. So we are fenced off and separate from that. I think the city often in the community often sees them together, which is kind of an obstacle we had to deal with at the time. But this is what it looks like now, and you can see kind of low density single buildings and quads. So next slide. So these are some before pictures. We renovated this in 2012. So we got the funding. So we renovated, I think we finished renovation in 2014. I'll talk more about the timeline in a minute. But this is a before picture. You can see it's, I deliberately showed this one kind of with a clothesline to kind of indicate that, the datedness of it, and kind of it captures what a lot of the, housing was kind of that era. Units are small. These are quads, kind of a dated brick look, one more, next slide. So you can see it's not a lot of landscaping. It was actually built in the middle of a pecan grove. All those trees are pecan trees around it. So the residents still to this day fight over the pecans that fall during the season. So, but yeah, otherwise it's, it was the landscaping was not attractive. It was really just bare bones, really very much in need of a renovation. I think there's one more before slide. Yep. So you can get a sense that it's so just a really dated look. The units actually were really small too. They didn't quite meet a lot of the standards, so we were addressing that. So yeah, a lot of physical needs. The physical needs assessment revealed a lot of capital needs that needed to happen just to kind of bring it up to a decent place. But we had some higher standards still, and the state of Georgia had some higher standards still. So anyway, next slide, please. So here's just a quick overview of it. Just wanted everyone to see kind of a visual of it first to get a sense of where it was and what it looked like. But it is 64 all one-bedroom units and 64 quads. So that is the design of it. Very low density, kind of a more expensive design to build and renovate than a more densely packed building, but common for rural areas. The tenancy is senior. But over time, it morphed into housing people with disabilities as well that were not seniors. And you'll see this as a HUD Section 8 contract on it. And that was an element of that. So we were really surprised when we got in and started working with the relocation that probably, almost half of the residents were not 62 and had some form of disability. So this property was definitely kind of the housing of last resort, other than maybe some trailer parks or something, rural housing, way out in the outside of the city, housing of last resort for the residents of BLACKSHEAR. So we got connected to the for-profit owner. Who owned it and had owned it since it was initially renovated. There was a minority nonprofit owner that was part of it. That's how we connected to them. So that'll be a big part of the story too. Like it was a for-profit that owned properties kind of throughout the East Coast, really. Just all over a lot of different markets in different states. And this was 2012, coming out of the recession, which is part of the story here. So he was trying to divest and basically, avoid bankruptcy. So this is one of the properties that he was trying to divest of at the time. And through the nonprofit owner, we connected and were able to work out an acquisition. Like I said, it needed a major renovation, but it had a really strong operating history and the market demand, and in part because that had a Section 8 contract. And that's HUD, that's not rural housing. So we're very much in a rural USDA rural area, but this happened to have a HUD HAP contract. And so I'll talk quite a bit more about that as we go, because there are some real contrasts that provided a ton of opportunity for us having that. I mean, really, this project would not have happened without that, and would not be anywhere near what it is and what it's been without that. But there are some very key differences between how HUD looks at their Section 8 and I'm still learning how USDA does, but it's that there's some big differences there. And like I said, this is 64 units in a city of about 3,500. We're about 2% of the population in just this property. So this is a really important property to the housing stock there. And houses just a lot of people and on disability. Half of them are simply only have disability for income. The other ones are on fixed income with Social Security. So a vast majority of our residents are earning less than $20,000 a year. So Yeah, and just one of the things that we're proud of too, and I can talk more about this, is that we brought some services to the property that hadn't been there too. Part of the nature of the rural housing was that the property manager not just collected rents and maintenance requests, but was kind of a a counselor and a confidant and a peacemaker and all this stuff too. So the property manager was at times felt overwhelmed with some of the needs of the residents, and just didn't have much to offer other than helping to learn a little bit about what other services were in town and all that. It's small town, so we were able to connect with a service provider to help bring in some services. So that was not there when we took it over. So so that's a brief overview of the project. Next slide, please. So here is the overall timeline. It was originally built in 1978, and I remember that date vividly because it was right around the time where lead-based paint was was banned. So we think there was no lead-based paint, so we think it was built very shortly after the ban. 10 years later, the owner that we bought it from acquired it and got a low-income housing tax credit allocation in 1990 to renovate it. This is very, very early in the tax credit program, so the rehab was very modest. But the compliance period then ended after they renovated in 92. The tax credit compliance period ended in 2007, so that allowed the seller to be kind of free of some of those requirements and sell it, divest of it. So Tapestry, again, connected with the minority nonprofit owner of the property. This is in 2011, again, right on the heels of the recession. And so that nonprofit wanted to buy the property and take out their majority for-profit owner and develop it themselves. They hired Tapestry to be a consultant. We do a lot of consulting, or we have done a lot of consulting for a lot of owners, especially nonprofits and preservation deals. So that was what we were doing here. They were 2 weeks into before the tax credit deadline. They were deemed not qualified by the state, which I had tried to warn them as a consultant that they were not going to be qualified. So we frantically tried to find another owner. But the good news was, for Tapestry, was that we were able to buy them out in 2012 and join a joint venture with an affiliate of the Macon Housing Authority. So Tapestry joint ventured to buy the current owner out in 2012. So we were really excited about that. Got an award of 9% tax credits in 2012, and so that allowed us to close and complete the second renovation in 2014. So that's a quick timeline of the project. So it has been, 8 years now. We're 8 years into the tax credit compliance period and have a long operating history now of the property. So next slide, please. So just wanted to give the development budget and just a kind of a sense of what it cost and what we had to do to make this happen. So again, this is now 8 years old. So I'll talk a little bit more about how these numbers would be different today. The simple answer is it would be more than double probably the cost. So we were able to acquire it for $1.5 million from the owner, about $24,000 a unit, which was amazing. It felt expensive at the time. Right? Today it would, you'll see, it'd be multiples of that. So we did a major renovation. So it was about $80,000 per unit. So that includes all the contractor costs and all that too. So that was it. We basically gutted the buildings. So I mean, there's, other than the walls and the foundations, we gutted it. We actually added space. We bumped out the back of the walls and added space to the back of the units to make them bigger and more compliant with other comparable properties and the kind of guidance that the state of Georgia had given us. So anyway, we did a very major renovation, and we had a lot of flooding. It's very, very flat area, and so parts of it would flood. So there was a pretty good amount of drainage and stormwater work we had to do, but mostly it was just that cost was gutting the units. The pre-development costs, development fee was pretty good. That's one of the beauties of using tax credits is, we can get a pretty good fee for the work. The reserves I'll talk more about in a minute. and then the other financing costs. So we, on the development side, I'll skip to the bottom. Low-income housing tax credits was the main source. You can see it's about 7.1 million of the 9.2 million. So that's most of the cost to do that. So that's the only way we're able to do a renovation of this magnitude. We had a small deferred fee. We did get a USDA loan. We had a private construction loan from Bank of America. But then we did a permanent only USDA 538. So that was it was a pretty good process. The program is, I understand, has changed quite a bit since then. And I know there'll be some speakers later at different times today, even I can talk more in depth about that. But it was a long process. We had to. My main memory of it is that our lender, USDA lender, who was based in Utah, had to fly to Athens, Georgia, and sit with the USDA representative there and literally flip pages and work explain every step of the process and all the forms and everything. So understand it's improved quite a bit since then, but it was a slow process that required our lender to have a heavy involvement, working through the agency side of it. But it's a great loan, and the terms were better than really anything we could find at the time. So that's at 1.3 million. That's also a relatively small loan. That is part of the beauty of USDA, is they're able and willing to do these smaller loans that a lot of HUD lenders and others just don't want to touch something that small. It's just they don't make a lot of money on it. It's a lot of work. So part of the story too is a related party loan. We had an AHP from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Atlanta. This is effectively a grant that I had gotten in the name of the previous developer in 2011 as a consultant. They had agreed to transfer that HP to us, to Tapestry, to help apply in 2012. But for some of their own reasons and underwriting reasons and everything, they ended up pulling that in the middle after we got the tax credit award. And before we closed, they pulled it. It was $575,000. They ended up pulling that HP. So one thing we joke about in our shop is that deals die several times in the course of the development process. And this is a place we thought the deal died, where we had this was like 6 weeks before we were hoping to close, that the AHP said, well, we have to pull it. You can apply in the next round. But it was too late. So the saving grace here was that our development partners had a very large reserve fund that were able to put in a loan to balance the budget and make it work. So some of the challenges that we face, and having some soft resources to help to fill gaps. So and so I guess go to the next slide. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about in terms of the budget. So here's where we are today. You can see really total transformation, new everything. We added new front porches, covered entryways. People would walk out the front door and immediately get wet, and didn't have any chance to kind of gather themselves. And so we added new, gables in front, front entrance, bumped that out. And then, you can't see it here, but we did bump out the back and added a couple hundred square feet. Maybe we added another room to the whole project. So you can see, get a sense of how the renovation came out. Really, really dramatic. Next slide. So here's the clubhouse. The clubhouse was extremely small. It was probably the size of 2 1-bedrooms. So we kept the front and basically just built tripled the size of it to add. There was no place for all the residents to gather together for meetings and other events. So we basically effectively built a brand new community space for them and management office. So one more slide. Yeah. So there's kind of the new sign and kind of the new picture of where it was. And so so just a real major success story there. That's all the question I can try to answer. The 515, I think I did not hear anything about the 515 loan when we were doing it. So I'm guessing that the original, maybe when they renovated in 1990, that they took out the 515, or we were not involved in that. So either it got taken out in 1992 when they renovated it, or it was just very quietly done by the seller. But that was, yeah. So that was not a play in here. So I know that adds, from what we've heard in previous presentations, and I'm sure we'll hear about more of that, can add a lot of complexity to these, is the 515 process, and especially if you want to keep the subsidy, and that's an option. Next slide. So kind of where we are today, again, we're 8 years in. The Section 8 contract rents are $635 net of utilities. So the residents pay, we pay the water and sewer, which are very low in this rural area, and they pay electricity. But other than that, so that, as you can see, the FMR is lower. So we're getting above market rents. That is a major reason we're able to do this in the first place. HUD has what's called an OCAF increase, operating cost adjustment factor, which is about 2% a year. So we get very reliable rent increases every year. I know in the USDA side, I'm eager to hear more about this and how this works, but I'll talk some more about the Section 8 contract here, and then kind of contrast it as I understand it to some of the RA programs. But when we renovated this, we got a 20-year contract for rental assistance, and it's rock solid. And so that the underwriters, saw this contract, and so effectively the market risk was zero. Like, this is going to stay full all the time, forever, as long as that contract's in place, because the residents are just paying 30% of their income towards rent, which in this case could be just a couple $100. So, but yes, because of the way this HAP contract works, we are able to get above market rents. Other HUD contracts require adjustments to be made based on market. So that our contract is we just get that OCAF increase. So over time, that contract has gone over market. So that really, really helps drive this deal and make it a really, really strong operating property for us. There's a couple other things I'll talk about in terms of the Section 8 contract, which could very much play out in an RA project as well. And again, this was coming out of the recession. So the investors are very conservative. They were still very wary of, real estate risk and all that. So we argued strenuously, and I think, the tenor to this day is we have a 20-year contract with HUD. Like, this is a federal agency that has, a contract, and the government has an obligation to fund it every year according to the terms of the contract. And our investor, and they also were looking at this issue and realizing that the rents were above prevailing market rents. So they took a very conservative approach, and said, we're only going to be able to underwrite to market rents and assume that, the HAP contract goes away, essentially. So we had to put in a large reserve, $260,000, a long-term reserve, with the expectation that the HAP contract would go away. And of course it hasn't, and it almost certainly never will, but that was a big risk that they had. And even with a 20-year HAP contract, they still underwrote that risk into the deal. So that really hurt us a lot. And that's required that $700,000 loan. If we could have underwritten to the contract rents, that loan would have either gone away or been much, much smaller. So, again, that was part of that investor, part the times, and then part kind of underwriting risk. So I think if on RA deals, if there's a contract and they're not able to give a 15-year or 20-year contract, which I don't think they do, it might be year to year. I'll be interested to hear more about that as part of the program. But they would, if those rents are higher than market based on the underwriting of the investor and lenders, then you may have to underwrite to a lower rent. So that's something I want to learn more about too, but just something that we hit that I think could show up on and impact some preservation deals for sure. So I think that's what I wanted to talk about there. So you had saw that we had bought it for $1.5 million, about a little less than 24,000 a unit, and we were able to get it off market. And so, yeah, I think today, and this is an estimate. I think, our NOI, which that's it's a really strong operating income right there for a rural property. And again, it's so driven by the Section 8. It would be less than that without it. So that the Section 8 really is the story of this. A capitalization rate, which is just a way to kind of evaluate, kind of a figure. If you're not familiar with it, just that it's divided by the net operating income to determine a price, and it's common weighted value. So that, based on my just back of the envelope, we're probably at 4.6 million or 72,000 per unit, and it could even be higher than that. These Section 8 properties are so valuable, and investors and developers buy them, and they're like, well, we'll break even, we'll make money on a sale down the road, and we have a management company will make money. So a lot of these properties with Section 8 are really, really getting driven up high in cost. And so, so you can see how dramatically different it would be to buy this property today. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I was just, spent some time reflecting on, if this property showed up on our radar today, would we be able to do the same thing we did in 2012 and 2014? Again, I said the HAP contract was a big part of the story. It sure was. Like, we would not have been able to look at it as a preservation deal without it. And DCA wouldn't have either. It was a HUD preservation project in the minds of the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, who was the allocating agency for the tax credits here in Georgia. They had a preservation priority back then that gave 5 points to a selected number of projects. And if you made it 5 points is huge. It's a total, a lot of the projects are determined based on 1 point. A cutoff would be like a 58, and projects are clustered between 54 and 61. So every point is valuable. So we got 5 points on this deal for preservation, and we had to compete under a subcategory to get those 5 points. So the HUD preservation office and the HAP contract was that it was considered a HUD preservation deal. We got HUD to give us a letter saying this was a high priority HUD project to preserve, and so the DCA gave us 5 points, and so we had the highest scoring project that year because of that. So those points are not there anymore, and they haven't been for many years now. So there are still some. It's circled back around a little bit, but that we went in knowing like we had a really good chance to have a really high score and put the money in and risk all our time and pre-development on this project. So we had the connection to the minority owner who was working with their majority owner on trying to divest, and I was still surprised that they were willing to work with us and be really, really patient with us on the tax credit execution. As you can see, we tried for over 2 years. So we tried in May of 2011, and then again in May of 2012, got it, and then closed on the land 6 months after the award. So we had a very patient seller that, so in this day and age, we would not have had that grace almost certainly from the seller. Since then, there's been really big changes. These Section 8 properties, a lot of it's just that was the weak economy. It was still tepid, but there is the brokerage network on these Section 8 properties is really mature right now and really robust, and really any property with Section 8, especially in this kind of it's above market, but that kind of a Section 8 contract is incredibly valuable. So they almost certainly would have taken their whole portfolio or chunks of it and given it to a broker to sell as a portfolio sale, which we're seeing a lot now. And so there would be somebody out there who would buy this and take it down in 90 days or 120 days. It'd be a HUD process, so it might take longer to transfer that HAP contract, but the seller now would be almost certainly able to sell it much quicker, just get the price they wanted without waiting for tax credit execution. So all those things would have made it much harder. Even if we had that connection to the minority owner, they would have probably just tried, sold it to the highest bidder, and not have been patient with us and working with, a smaller local nonprofit. So So those are some challenges today, but I think this deal could work maybe now this year. In the last 5 years, it would not have scored. There was no preservation priority in the 9% round. The DCA was putting all their they wanted to do most of their preservation within the 4% low-income housing tax credits, which would not have given us nearly enough equity in this project to do it. So that would have not been financially feasible. But now HUD has or the DCA now has a preservation set aside, and I think they started last year. So they've come around. There is no USDA. We learned that in a recent session with DCA, that they do not have a preservation set aside for USDA. They have a few places where they give some preference for USDA, but there's no special set aside for rural preservation, just HUD and RAD and a couple other things. So, and again, DC is kind of looking at their own portfolio as well that are not necessarily rural, but they're not necessarily having a USDA on it. But they have their own, catalog, portfolio of properties that need preservation, and so they want to incentivize preserving some of the stuff that's in DCA stock, and that is a challenge for them. So, if it happens to have USDA also, that's a benefit too. But so that's another challenge. But because there's a HUD element on this, we might be able to compete. I think we could actually compete for the HUD preservation set aside this under the 9% round. But again, the cost would be double. The construction cost would almost certainly be double. Be really hard to find. I mean, it was back then hard to find subcontractors that were, sophisticated enough to work in a rural area and go out and work in BLACKSHEAR. And we developed it in phases, so it took a lot longer. We emptied it out. We dropped occupancy by attrition, so we had at first 8 units vacant, 2 buildings, and gave those to the contractor. And then there was more natural attrition from people moving, and so we gave them 3 buildings later and 4. Eventually, they finished up. So the soap hunters had to keep going out and doing. They couldn't just do it all in one swoop. So it was hard to get. The costs went way up from what we were thinking because of that. So that's kind of where we are. That's BLACKSHEAR. So I'd welcome any other questions on that. But it is, the HUD piece really does make it, really did drive it. And I know that's really unique to some of these rural properties, and not necessarily, those aren't really the challenge, right? With the rural preservation, it's the ones with, RA or not even with RA. So, I have one more slide to kind of talk about a non-success story. This is something we've been trying to look at for years. We have a friendly owner who has divested of a number of his properties, kind of some of his non-core properties throughout the state over the years. But these are ones that he just can't seem to sell. And we've been, kind of like a lot of developers, we kind of look at them every year and say, hey, is this the year we can do this? So we've been trying to figure it out too. But he's got a portfolio of 3 rural properties. One's in Northeast Georgia, and they're all in solid markets. They're all in solid areas that, the properties are operating fine. The first one has rental assistance, USDA rental assistance. So that's helping that one a lot. There's a 40-unit one that is in basically the North Metro area now. It's not in the rural area anymore. I know it's still eligible for rural preservation benefits, but that it's not rural anymore. So it's kind of strong in its own right, market wise. But there's no RA on that. And then they have another one in Central Georgia that is also, the city's kind of grown up around it, but it's still in a rural area. But it's also a solid property, but there's no RA on that one either. I have been told that some of the residents got RA under the rescue plan, but they're not project based. So the residents have it, which is great for them. And as long as they stay on the property, they can have it. So it should bring some real stability to those households and keep them. It'll be good for the owner, that they'll almost certainly stay longer and not have the turnover costs and all that. But it's not an underwritable thing, because it's that there's no telling when that assistance will go away to the owner. She's being a benefit. So they're all almost 30 years old now. They all need major renovation. They're all they need a low income housing tax credit level of investment. $80,000 a unit or more, like that some modest renovation would help for sure, but it's not, gonna really move the needle on, on assessing all the needs that they really have. And, that would just be really short-term fixes instead of really repositioning it long-term. It has not scored well under tax credits, either any of them or, altogether. The DCA is moving projects towards areas that are in stable communities, which means higher income areas, better school systems, so they want affordable housing in places where it's scarce, or more scarce or harder to build, or they also want it in redevelopment areas that are lower income, but they actually have active redevelopment plans, and they're not, there's other redevelopment going on. So they're looking for areas in those two quadrants, and almost every deal that gets funded is in one of those two sections. Most properties in most places are in the middle, including where all these properties are. So it doesn't quite score. You really need to be in one of those two areas to even start out of the competitive score. So the other issue too, and I'll just jump down to the bottom, they're small. The amount of work it takes for low-income housing tax credits is, it's a 3-year process, and we're often have some choices on what deals we pursue, and a smaller project, the 53 units is probably in the ballpark. It's something we would pursue if it scored, but the other ones are kind of too small to, that we find other opportunities where we can get a lot more units, a lot more operating efficiencies. So that's, again, a big challenge that's been brought up a lot on this series, of that is the size of these properties make it hard to pursue some of the sources that really help and really can make a really profound difference, like tax credits. They're also not in a qualified census tract or a difficult to development area. Those are defined census tracts that that HUD publishes that help bring additional equity to low-income housing tax credit projects. They're an automatic 30% boost. So those really help, and especially if we're looking at a 4% project, which has until recently been non-competitive. But if we're doing a 4% project, there's less equity, so that boost is all that much more important than a 9%. So the 4% require a lot bigger scale too. Like doing even 53 units would be a very small 4% bond project. So so that it's hard to do. We were looking at it as a portfolio. I know there's a presentation later on portfolio, which I'm eager to hear a little bit about, but so that really hurts the underwriting of these projects too, that there's not that automatic boost in any of these. And then, so there's no RA on 2 of them. So that really hurts, or no project-based RA. So, we might be able to increase rents if we did a major renovation, but not much. And that's obviously not what we want to do as a nonprofit. And that's not really what we want to do as a preservation strategy really either. But, the rents are, there's not a lot of upside anyway in the market. So, so that's just one example of a rural property that we would love to solve, and hopefully, this and some others we're looking at will bring some of the resources to help us think about that. But so that's my presentation. I'd love to hear any other questions or comments or anything else.
Thanks, John. That was great. Really helpful for us to go through that. I have lots of questions that have started to come up.
Great.
One is, I was hoping that you talked about there's a minority owner and then there's a local nonprofit. Were you a development partner? Were you a turnkey developer? Do you continue to own and manage this property?
Yes. We it was in Tapestry's very early days. It was our very first 9% award in 2012. We started in 2010. So we had to be a minority owner and work with an experienced group. I mean, Tapestry had tons of in-house practical experience, but we had to be qualified under the Georgia Department of Community Affairs, and so basically have a long track record of successful properties. So we had to partner with somebody. So we brought this deal, we got it under contract and brought it to our partner, and so they were the managing general partner, but we were very heavily involved with it. So we're a 30% owner, I think. So we did all the underwriting, we did a lot of the due diligence. We, brought in our relationships with a general contractor and architect and other things. So we had a very heavy involvement, and we continue to be 30% owner.
And And then the management and operation is handled by the other organization.
Yeah, we have a third-party manager that we've hired, and they manage a lot of our partners' portfolio around the state. So, but this, with the HAP contract, the rents are really solid. It's an easy property to manage in that regard.
Right.
So,
your cash flow is going to be consistent because
the management
your
fees
rent is
really,
all coming in from your RA.
Yeah,
for sure. Another question you mentioned it's that you were doing a rolling rehab, right? So you're doing it quad by quad, it sounds like. And yes, and that takes a long time and created some issues with the subs. Would you do it that way again? I mean, I know that relocation costs are so high that often there's not other ways to do it. So just curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think we would have to. I think there's just not, like, again, we're 2% of the housing stock in the city, so there's not places to move 64 people that are earning, that can pay rent affordably at $200 or $300 a month. So, in some other projects we're working on, we've had to figure that out, and it's been really complicated. But it minimized any displacement, and just it would have been way more expensive to move people off and move them back, and we would have lost some people, and and there wasn't any guarantee that we'd be able to keep the rental assistance contract. We had to get HUD's approval to leave units vacant. So I think to vacate the property and bring them back, there wasn't an obvious solution there, just from the HAP contract and just the nature of the housing stock in the area.
Yeah, no, I have found, yes, it's a very tedious process to do rolling rehab, but I think it's sort of the most cost-effective solution for sure. And even though you just have to plan for the delays and time, which also creates additional costs, but figuring out what the the cost benefit analysis is there. We do have a question in the chat about the state QAP process. Has there been advocacy to address the disparities between urban and rural and to elevate concerns with rural rental housing preservation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know DCA talked about it a little bit. It sounded like maybe even that the panel a couple weeks ago got their attention and realized, we don't have a USDA preservation set aside. But yeah, on one hand, DCA takes a lot of pride in their rural housing. That they, 30 or 35% of the tax credits go to rural housing. But that's almost all new construction. So it's there's no special incentive for preservation over new construction. So new construction is almost always easier to do. And, you can find the census tracts that score and put a new construction project there instead of hoping that, like these properties here, just they are where they are, and they're in the census tracts they are, and the data is what it is. We can't, they just don't score. There's little we can do. So I think DCA is, wisened up to it some. But again, just it's hard to do smaller, most developers don't want to do a 32 unit project. I would love to do that where it's located with the rental assistance, but it would be at the expense of another place, and and it doesn't score either. But even if it did, it's a small project, and we can do a 60 unit project somewhere else. So yeah,
it's a balance, right? And I think that, but I agree. I think that we've been hearing with DCA has been on the past couple of calls, really talking about how they're trying to figure this out, and it does sound like they are interested in working with USDA and preservation on a set aside or something like that as well. So we have to continue telling them it's needed, I think, as part of it, and continue to provide that feedback. There's a question from David in the Q&A asking, did the developer fees get divided according to ownership? Like percentage, I would imagine is what.
In this case they did. Yeah. So we got 30% of that fee. And so, it was a lot of fee for us back in our early days. So, but yeah, so it's, we did, in this case, it's not always how it works. Like we went in with our partners, saying, hey, we're equals, in Tapestry, we don't have the experience. The group that has the experience should get the most of the fee, and they have the bulk of the guarantee risk, which is another big thing. As you might know, that there's a lot of inherent risk on underwriting these. The investors expect the developers to fund shortfalls at different times. And so our partners had the liquidity and the cash and the balance sheet to do that, and they had the experience. So just those two things alone, and being the managing partner, like they deserve the majority of the fee. So they were nice, but we had a lot to offer too, and we did a lot of the work. So 30% was fair on that in that case. We're much more mature now, and we could do it ourselves, and would if we could, but we'd still partner. But we would probably want more than 30% without.
And back to that sources and uses chart. So you talked about the AHP came out, which that's, I like the fact deals die several times through the course of a project. I think that's really true. I've seen it happen. I mean, you probably felt it died also when you got denied tax credits the first round. And I've been through many projects where I was like, this road's going to kill this project, the turnaround for the fire truck. And somehow they managed to get done, right? We have to have a lot of perseverance, particularly I think as we think in rural communities. But that AHP loan, that AHP money came out, and then you had a large soft cost. Is that where your soft costs were $662,000, which seems like a lot? And then is that partly because part of that was funding? Like, how did you make up for the AHP and that development sources and uses chart?
Yeah, there's that 700,000 source from our partners. Okay. They were affiliated with the Macon Housing Authority. They're called Infill Housing. They're a really strong group, and these days they just focus on Macon mostly, but we, drew them out of Macon for a few years at other parts of the state. But that they had built some reserves from some of their other projects, and so had it, and just that's not common.
And it was written in as a secondary loan, right? That's how. Yeah.
So we have, you saw how good the cash flows are, but all the cash flows have gone towards that loan over the years. So Tapestry's gotten no cash out of the deal for 8 years and for many more. So
it's in the waterfall from cash flow is how it gets paid. Got it. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thanks. I just always want to know, I'm like, okay, well, what happens? Somewhere that has to get paid back. So awesome. Yeah. Well, I think that's really helpful. I don't see any other questions right now, John, but should y'all have any other questions? We've got John's email, which we'll share in the follow-up to this. And then, as the cohort, we can all talk together too more about projects like this, but really appreciate that. And really looking at this and also looking at HUD HAP project as well, because there's a lot of rural stock that's HUD HAP 202, 811, or a combination, as you saw in this project. I used to work for a group that owned and managed 2 different combo 202, 811 properties. So I think that it's really helpful to look at these as well. Also interesting to see how you did a full gut, which often doesn't happen as we think of preservation, and an added space, which really does enhance the units at the end of the day. So awesome. Thank you so much for sharing, John. And I think we're going to move on to our next set of speakers. We have Will Eckstein and Amy Kofini. They're both from Greystone Affordable Development. Will is the Senior Vice President of Business Development at Greystone, and Amy is the Senior Vice President of Development. I think I've got that right, y'all. And Greystone has done a tremendous amount of affordable housing preservation in the Southeast. And we really wanted to hear, and it's been really successful at work, particularly involving portfolio preservation. And it's a really interesting model to look at, and something I wanted y'all to hear more about as we continue to do the Preservation Academy. So I brought in the folks I know who know the most about it. That's Will and Amy, and they're going to talk about that for a bit. Thank you so much, Will and Amy, for joining us.
Happy to be here. Robin and Adrian, thank you for having us. Happy to be a part of the Preservation Academy and be back. So I know we've done several different sessions throughout the course of this, and so we really appreciate the opportunity. So this is our little title slide. We'll move on to the next one, please. Yeah, perfect. So this basically lays out the framework for our presentation today. We're going to go through, do a little introduction and background on Greystone, share a little bit more about our company, talk about the opportunity, and then the essential tool that we see for putting together these portfolio transactions. Go a little bit deeper into the scattered site preservation, pros, cons, the process, some of the keys to success that we deem. Share a little bit of a success story there that we've had there in Georgia, and then conclude and kind of wrap up with some what we think are words of wisdom or advice, maybe warnings, I guess, all one and the same. So that's kind of the framework for our presentation today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Greystone from a corporate standpoint, and just a little bit more about who we are and how we would fit into the picture and kind of our background. But Greystone is a privately held national commercial real estate company, investment and advisory firm. Our corporate headquarters is actually located in New York City, but the affordable team where Amy and I sit is located in Raleigh, North Carolina. We are, the primary platform that is Greystone is our lending platform. We're number one, number two, number three FHA lender in the country, depending on the year, and also have our Fannie Mae and Freddie licenses in our top 5, top 10, depending on the year from a lending perspective as well. As you can see here, we've got a couple different family of companies from our real estate finance group, structured finance, loan servicing and asset management, investment sales brokerage, and then right down into the affiliated businesses. You can see where we're highlighted. We're the affordable housing development team. Like I said, we sit in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our group got its start about 15 years ago. And over the course of that 15 years, we've done about 15,000 units of affordable housing development in partnership with owners, operators, developers, nonprofits, for-profits, public housing authorities. And really the reason that we're here today is because the majority of that work that we've done has been in the rural space and in partnership with RD 515 owners doing scattered site transactions. So we appreciate the opportunity. And that's kind of a little bit about Greystone and specifically Greystone Affordable Development. Next slide, please. And I know you guys have had the benefit of sitting through a couple of earlier sessions through the Southeast Preservation Academy and giving some background on specifically, I think the majority of you on the call today may sit in Georgia, but Mississippi and Alabama as well. And so you guys are here today because of this opportunity and because of what you probably already know and because of the mission side of what you do. But the way that we always frame this conversation and dialogue is, to be able to have a meaningful impact within the rural communities that you serve. We often talk about the tripod of healthcare, housing, and education, and how those come together. And Greystone's focus is really on housing and how we can deliver that and help support those efforts within the rural markets, within the markets that our partners serve. Oftentimes, as you guys know, these rural communities have limited access to housing in general, and certainly limited access to affordable housing. I think just these stats and pulling across the 3 states that we're focused on through this Southeast Preservation Academy, the 44,000 RD homes across Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. That's a ton of housing in these rural markets. I think the national average of the RD 515 portfolio is approximately 33 years. And then the annual household income for those with 521 rental systems is just $11,500. So obviously, access to housing is important across the country. It's not unique to the Southeast. It's not unique to the specific states. It's a world, it's a crisis across the country, but specifically, the work that you can do within the communities that you serve is certainly meaningful and impactful. And based off of this, through the RD 515 portfolio, there's a lot of opportunity to be impactful within the communities within these 3 states. Next, we're going to talk about what we deem as an essential tool for preservation. So, and I know that we're coming in and assuming a little bit of a higher level of framework for the conversation and dialogue, but and you guys may be familiar with this or may not, but we're just going to talk through, what we deem as the essential tool for preservation work is, the housing credit is the country's most successful affordable housing rental production program that since its inception in 1986, I think it's produced some 3 million homes during that period of time. And really you break down, and I know John talked about this earlier, so you guys have familiarity with it. You've probably talked about it in previous sessions, but the difference between the two types of housing credits, there's the 9% credits and the 4% credits. John talked about his example and opportunity was using the 9% credit for the funding source that he went through. And as it sounds like based off of the questions, you guys are familiar with that process. It's a competitive process. There's a limited supply of resources, and certainly DCA and the QAP there set specific criteria funding between rural markets and or more urban and suburban markets, and sets that. And that's not unique to Georgia. That's across all the housing finance agencies across the country set their own criteria and their own priorities in the way that they fund those deals. Obviously 9% deals get more equity into the transaction, make them more feasible within the markets that you're trying to accomplish this. But oftentimes some of the challenges that you face in putting together deals in the rural space with 9% credits is that they're not going to score. Maybe they're smaller, at least for the preservation, the unit count's going to be smaller. And it's just not going to be competitive in that process. Excuse me. So the 4% credits, and that's separate outside of the limited pool that is the 9% credits that you go through that funding process. It also comes in conjunction with the tax-exempt bond financing. In theory, I know Georgia's a little bit of a different story as we are bumping up against some restrictions in other states as well. But in theory, it's a non-competitive process. There's tax-exempt bond capacity in those states, and so you can access that as a funding tool. There's oftentimes where they have that strict set of criteria that is defined for 9% fundings and 9% applications. There's more flexibility oftentimes in the tax-exempt bond and 4% credit funding round. You can deviate, maybe have waivers that are involved in the process, which is helpful when you're putting together deals and transactions that may have some additional challenges or in markets that aren't necessarily fitting that box that we talk about in the 9% rounds. And then also what the tax-exempt bond financing and the 4% credits, and what we've been able to do and structure in our transactions is scattered site portfolio transactions. So that's confined to one state, but multiple communities across the state. So not limiting yourself to just the Atlanta metro area or Waycross or the community that is within that community, but communities within a single state, and able to impact those rural communities across the state in one single transaction, one single financing, one single structure. And so that's kind of, again, that's why we're here today, talking about a little bit about our success and what we've done within those markets and how we've made that work. Obviously, and we say this all day long, if you can get 9% credits on an RD 515 deal, you should certainly do it, because the dollars are going to be ample, and the impact you can maybe make within that community can be significant. And there's more dollars that would flow into it through that 9% credit. But we go back to the challenges that faces the RD 515 properties and the portfolios, that they're smaller in nature and oftentimes they don't qualify. So if you're looking to make an impact and do something on a larger scale, doing the scattered site transactions is advantageous in that regard. And it allows you to access and tap into those financial resources that make deals ultimately financially feasible. There are pros and cons to the scattered site transactions. And so the next slide is going to talk a little bit more about some of the pros that we see. We'll get to the cons as well. I just kind of touched on this to a little bit, but the scattered site portfolio transactions is large scale preservation. You're able to impact more communities in one transaction across a state, not just locally. And oftentimes that's the benefit, being able to do more at one time in a higher volume. Another thing that we talk about is, the ability to finance, the smaller properties, communities that only have 24 units here, 12 units here, 36 units. Oftentimes going out into the open market and trying to get debt and equity is a challenge. You may not have that desire to do one small 32 unit deal in Waycross, Georgia. You'd rather do a 320 unit deal in suburban or metro Atlanta, just because it's still the same amount of work as far as appraisals, market studies, and kind of going into a single site or a single community versus the smaller nature of that. And so multiplying so when you aggregate and put 10 300 or 10 32 unit communities together, there's more debt, more equity associated with it, so you have more volume, which makes that more attractive to some of the lenders and some of the investors that wouldn't want to just put in those small dollar amounts on that single site. That may be an easier transaction or an easier execution for them to deploy those dollars is in larger communities. So we're able to make it more attractive to finance smaller properties in rural communities by aggregating it and bring the debt and equity investors to the table. Talked about this earlier too, but there's a little bit more flexibility through the tax-exempt bond 4% process, as opposed to the 9% where you got to check all those boxes and be competitive and go through that criteria. But it also allows for flexibility across a portfolio. You're going to have properties in a multi-property transaction that are stronger properties within the aggregate of the properties. So you're going to have those properties that are in stronger markets that can absorb larger rent increases and can take on additional debt. You're going to also have those properties that may be kind of back to John's point on some of the challenge that he was facing on those 3 properties that he was looking at. Their rents are constrained. They can't raise rents in the markets where they are. And so they're having a difficulty being able to attract and bring in additional funding sources to do it. When you aggregate and put in a portfolio transaction, you're able to allocate the resources accordingly to those properties that more need it and those that don't. So ultimately, there's flexibility in that. Economies of scale, going out and buying 32 dishwashers versus 320 dishwashers. There's a big difference in that. So spreading the fixed costs of legal counsel and borrowers counsel and bond counsel across a multitude of properties is impactful in underwriting and ultimately getting to the financial feasibility and making sure that the numbers work and can be supported within this type of transaction. That 32 unit bond deal is going to be very difficult to make pencil from a numbers perspective. But again, on a scale, you're able to spread the fixed costs and have buying power associated throughout the process. And again, you're impacting more rural communities. You're getting involved in areas that may not have seen investment over the last 50 years, that the housing stock is sitting there, and local communities are drying up, and this may be the one area that there's still residents that need places and access to housing. And you're able to do this, not just in the one community that the 32 unit property sits in, but the multitude of communities around the state that you're able to serve by doing this. So it's a volume thing, and it's impactful. And then you're also able to, just from an allocation of resources, and we talked about advocacy within DCA and talking to them about the way that they structure the allocation of their credits by aggregating multiple properties into one transaction, accessing tax-exempt bond financing and 4% credits. You're able to remove some of those properties potentially from 9% funding rounds that could maybe stand on their own in a competitive process, but are brought over and help work a portfolio and can be one of the stronger properties potentially in a portfolio transaction that helps balance it out and balances out the resources and balances out the impact across the state and across those rural communities that we're all trying to impact and serve. So, but obviously with pros, there are some cons to transactions. So we'll talk about those next within these scattered site portfolios. Complexity, that I think that's number one. And it's I say to a certain extent, that single site transaction that John ran through earlier, it is not to a certain extent. We do that times 32 or times 44. and are putting together sources and uses and underwritings and applications and transfer applications to RD and tax credit applications and tax exempt bond financing applications on times however many properties that we're including within that. And so I often don't say it's not it's not anything different from what John was doing. It's just on a complexity. It's more of a volume game. You're reviewing various market studies, various appraisals across all different markets, and having the resources and the time to be able to dedicate and allocate and balance out a portfolio across all the moving parts, while still sourcing debt and equity, and going through the RD transfer process to be able to have that acquisition rehab is complex, and it's not for the faint of heart is the way that we like to look at it. The next thing, expensive. We always talk about the costs associated with bonds. So, and kind of the one thing that we always say, not to offend anyone on the call that might be a lawyer, but we always say everyone always brings their lawyer to the table on these bond transactions. So are there more soft costs and costs associated with that financing, and more people that have to be involved in tax exempt bond transactions with 4% credit. So and those costs add up, and so. Again, kind of going back to the benefit of that is that the more properties you have that in aggregate to a portfolio, you're able to spread those costs across multiple transactions, which is helpful. But in general, bond transactions are deemed expensive. Hence why a 32 unit bond transaction would not work, but potentially a 320 unit aggregate portfolio may work across multiple communities. Talk a little bit about the tax credit, or the free money, the equity coming into transactions. Oftentimes that's driven by CRA investors, those looking to deploy dollars in communities where they take on deposits. And in these rural communities, there's potentially a lack of CRA investors looking to invest within those markets. And so oftentimes you see lesser pricing within the rural communities where we serve. And when we go out to market and kind of go try to take the deal to market and get offers back in, those within rural communities tend to get a lesser pricing than those. We try to offset that a little bit with dangling the carrot of the volume associated with transactions. And Amy's going to walk through a transaction in a little bit where you're going to see the staggering number of credits and the dollars invested within the communities that we serve. But typically the rural communities are going to garner a little bit less in the equity pricing associated with it. You talk about resources. Again, this kind of goes back to the complexity, but it's a volume thing. Just being able to handle, a portfolio transaction. And I guess, and to a certain extent, it doesn't have to be 44 communities. It doesn't have to be 32 communities. You can do a portfolio of 5 or 6, and certainly there'll be less required resources to be able to move forward. But the required resources are, whatever it takes to do, the 60 units in BLACKSHEAR is going to be, times 10 if you're putting together a scattered site. So resources are additional when you're putting together a multitude of properties. And I think everybody on the call is probably familiar with where construction pricing is today and the challenges that we're seeing in supply chain and being able to. And John touched on this as well, so I'm going to reference John a lot, but what the cost would be today for a deal that he did 10 years ago in 2012 versus what those rehab costs for those would be. So in general, we try to spend those dollars on in-place rehabs. And so that means working with, a contractor that's skilled and can handle that. It's not for the faint of heart, and it's not for every GC. But construction in place and having a strong management team and a strong GC that can handle going in and out of units, so that we're not spending. So we're spending those dollars able to cover the increase in construction costs, but also not spending dollars on on alternative housing during that construction period. And I think John even referenced this, but housing 2% of the population in BLACKSHEAR. What we would see is oftentimes there's not alternatives for people to move out of their homes within the communities where they live. In-place rehabs are a necessary part of our process from a cost standpoint, and also more so, from where we sit today and alternatives to be able to make that happen. And then the final kind, when you're putting together, this kind of builds on the rest of them, but the timelines associated with a portfolio transaction is extensive. It doesn't happen overnight. You're kind of bringing together different agencies, from the State Housing Finance Agency to RD, to potentially HUD if you have a Section 8 contract, all of the moving parts and the processes with government having limited resources, limited staff that are able to impact and do that. So from that standpoint, the timelines do take, and also putting together the financial resources and securing those on behalf of the opportunity take time, and they're often in defined time cycles that you're able to pursue and secure those. Next, I think Amy's going to walk us through a little bit of a high level talk about the process in general, and it's not linear. But she'll give us a good overview and handles a lot of the details, and really is the mastermind in kind of putting these deals together and moving them forward once they come into our shop, and does a great job. So she's a wealth of knowledge.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, I will try to not dive into the details. It's very hard to keep me out of them. I'll try to give a high level, but I've been doing this with Greystone in the USDA space for the past 11 years. And, the process has changed a bit since when I started. I think the realignment has been a big change for RD. We kind of went from this, when we would go into a state and start working on the portfolios, we would go to the state director and really work with the field staff within that state. The benefit was they knew the assets, they knew the property, they knew the market. Sometimes it was detrimental because, they're also the asset manager. So when you come to them to process a transfer application, it wasn't quite their skill set. I do think that the realignment to the national team has been, I have seen process improvements there. They're very transparent with what the timeline will be, which is very helpful. You'll see, that's a theme of mine, is the timeline is very important for all these transactions. The national team really, when they realigned, they kind of looked at all of the folks that worked within RD within all their states, really looked at their skill sets and determined, what sector that they were going to fall in under the realignment. So now we've got folks that are very familiar with the transfer process working on transfers, and folks that are very strong with asset management working on asset management details. So, I think the realignment has been a big success in my mind so far. The biggest thing, I said at the top of this is communication with RD, so that you can, really drive your own timeline and communicating with all the folks that are part of these portfolio transactions. Kind of the steps that I think about, when we first start out is, identifying potential sites. There's a litany of things that I think are probably important, but the most important is a patient seller. There's a lot of debate within Greystone whether these big portfolio transactions, do they take 18 months, or do they take 4 years? We kind of debate that. And, I really kind of point to what John had said earlier: deals die often and come back to life. And, you can have a deal, you can be working on a deal for 4 years and it'll die 2 deaths and, be a success at the end. So, you definitely want a patient seller. I think rental assistance is very important, especially on the transactions that we've worked on. As Will alluded to, you've got strong properties and weak properties, and with the rental assistance, you're able to increase rents without much impact to the current tenants there. You also want to make sure that when you're talking with your seller, that there's a reasonable expectation of sales price. On our preservation portfolios, we do assume the 515 debt. That keeps the 521 rental assistance in place. So, the purchase price versus what the appraisal is going to come back at, with that assumed debt, sometimes there isn't a lot of equity on the table for the seller. And it's just really understanding what that seller's expectations are, and, to make sure that, when you get to the end of the transaction, that everybody's going to be happy with, the sales proceeds they're going away with. Once you've kind of identified the potential sites, what we do is we go into kind of our feasibility analysis stage. Within our shop, we'll release the appraisal and the market study phase ones, really get the third party started from that perspective. And then we will send out a construction team to go out with the architect and the general contractor to really kind of develop a scope of work based on the needs of the property. At the same time, the capital needs assessment has been released, and that's really where we start kind of bringing together what we think is going to be a feasible transaction. From there, we have, Greystone has kind of a back of the envelope, what we think the operating expenses will be, because we'll use a 3-year historical. We'll look at what we think the market will handle for rent increases based on how much RA is on each property. And then we'll basically size what we think the new debt on the project will be, using 538 financing. Communication with the lender early and often is important in this phase. One of the key things that we came up with, we didn't actually create this, but we decided to start working with USDA and the housing agency on a concept meeting. That's where we go with our initial feasibility, and we say, this is what we think the portfolio is going to look like, how many properties, how many units. We'll give them basic metrics, as in the rent increases, rental assistance, operating expenses. We'll kind of go through that. We'll talk about the structure of the ownership that oftentimes depends upon the investor, and then we'll really sit down with them and talk through. USDA has a underwriting process that's unique to USDA assets. They work on a zero-based budget, and that doesn't always translate to the housing agencies. So we'll oftentimes have this concept meeting where we'll meet with the USDA first, usually, just to make sure that no red flags stick out to them on, how our underwriting metrics. And then we'll discuss with them the waivers that we're going to go into the agencies for, in Georgia specifically. We went into Georgia on a lot of architectural waivers, as well as underwriting waivers. Underwriting waivers, almost always with every state we've worked in, is debt service coverage ratios, the OPEX minimums, already underwrites to a 3-year historical. Vacancy rates, as John and Will both alluded to, oftentimes these projects are, the only option within a 20-mile radius. So these properties we find often have, 100% occupancy for the last 3 years. Oftentimes, DCA, I believe they default to a 7% vacancy. Understanding the asset that is a USDA product, that's a waiver that we'll oftentimes go in for. And reminding folks that the big pressure point for RD is that rental assistance, higher vacancy, higher OPEX drives the rents up. And so we're trying to make sure that we're preserving the RA and the rental increases that we're going to need for the project. So very much looking at the operations and making sure that we talk through the waivers with the agencies. And then the most important part of that concept meeting with both folks is the timeline, setting out expectations for when we think we're going to be submitting applications into them, making sure we're staying out of the 9% round with the state agency, and then also, working with RD to make sure that, what time of the year we're coming into them with, 20 transfer apps on their desk. August and September, October are not the greatest times to go into RD. We have done it before. It just, it's painful on everybody's part. So, trying to stay away from that year-end time period is pretty key. So the timeline is really important, making sure that, if it's going to be 18 months, if there's an open or closed cycle with the agency, making sure we line up with that. So after the concept meeting, we really sitting down, now that we've got our waivers, and sometimes the agencies will give us the waivers, sometimes they won't. So then we'll look at our numbers again, our initial analysis, and we'll go out to debt and equity just to make sure our interest rate's in line, any kind of reserves that are going to need to be set up. We also meet with equity investors. it's important to talk with any equity investor. The 9% equity investor is not always going to be a 4% equity investor, and they're not always going to be a rural equity investor. So folks you've used on the 9% side may not be interested in a 4% portfolio in rural America. So making sure that you're speaking with them early to make sure you get a firm understanding of what equity pricing will be. And also, if there's education period also with the equity investors on the USDA product. If you're talking to a 538 lender, they get RD. But really with equity, you want to make sure that you're talking with them often about, how RD deals underwrite. All that period goes by and we come to the point where we validate our assumptions. So the appraisal comes in, market study comes in, CNA comes in, phase one. We've got a scope of work, we've got our hard cost numbers, and we've really kind of determined at that point, were our assumptions correct or not? Once we validate those assumptions, we move into the application process. It has been our experience that having RD underwrite first is an essential step to a successful portfolio. Getting a transfer app and your lender app, whether it be 538 or Fannie Mae, you want to get those applications into RD first. They set the rents, they approve the budgets, they set the loan amounts, they really underwrite the transfer. And you want to have all those items tied up before you go in to ask for your bonds and your credits. It's a best practice. That's a big topic of the concept meeting. And that'll be part of the outline, that I go over in the concept meetings, making sure that, every agency understands, who should go first in their underwriting, and kind of dropping back to, once we've kind of gone through the RD process, getting the credit side going is what is, that next second step. Once we've gotten through kind of the credit process and with the agency, initial closing is a big step. You'll hear me talk about our key partners, but closing, I think I start thinking about closing every single night before I go to bed 3 months ahead of the closing. It is a huge process to get that many projects closed at one time. Sometimes it's 20 projects, sometimes it's 40. I think we've done a portfolio as small as 6, but it is a big process. It is a big weight on the shoulders of USDA. It's a big weight on the shoulders of the agency. And it's making sure that you're having clear communication. At this point, I'm having weekly calls with anybody that'll talk to me, basically. So I have weekly calls with RD. I have weekly calls with the state agency. We have bond calls on top of that. Just making sure that everybody is inching forward and together and in unison, and kind of attacking any issues that might pop up prior to closing, so that you're really staying on that timeline. The construction period is another really important part. I kind of wanted to point to what John had said earlier about the management company. I hadn't really thought about that until John brought it up, but a really key component of these portfolios being successful is a strong manager at the site and a strong management company to back that manager up. We've been fortunate enough to work with very strong management companies. The manager is really your cheerleader on site that helps with the process of, having the construction team come in and really disrupt people's lives for, a month or two while their community is under construction. Greystone has found that an in-place rehab is the most efficient way to do these statewide portfolios. Another point being, there's not a lot of options for where people can go. We've got, even sometimes the closest hotel is 20 miles away. So, the in-place rehab is a very big component of what we do. Over the last 2 years during COVID, we had underwritten relocation costs because we didn't have, we weren't going to be able to have a contractor in, the same space as, the tenant. And so we did have to move people out to hotels. And a good, an example of that is we had a portfolio in Kentucky in which, I think everyone knows last summer there was some very horrible tornadoes that went through the state. Well, our relocation costs, we had estimated, let's say hotel costs were going to be $100 for one unit. After the tornado, the hotel costs went up probably threefold. So that was a big point, which, if we had been able to do an in-place rehab, we could have, really contained those costs. Just all things to think about. You can't think of everything. We try very hard, but, that was something that we had not considered. So we're having a bit of an overrun on relocation, but, we're working through it. Being in close contact with your general contractor, your architect during that period, making sure, that there's clear communication, and a big component there is still continue to keep RD and the agency involved during the construction period, because you're flying through pay apps and, trying to move people in and out if you cannot do an in-place rehab. So being in close communication with RD is very important, and also the agency, to make sure that, you've got your 100% sign off on construction and can continue on to the next project. Construction completion is another big component that is very important, as you're reaching. So let me back up for a second. So on a 20 property portfolio, our construction schedule is going to go east to west, north to south. It's going to go in directional order. We'll start the first community on month 1, and then on month 2, we'll start the second community. Month 3, start the third community. We've found that working in groups is probably the best approach. Maybe have 4 to 5 construction jobs open at a time, in a 6 to 8 month period, trying to close out, the first project. Once you get to project 7 is really important, making sure that there's no punch items on project 1. But really making sure that, you've got your construction order moving across the state is very important. And making sure that, you've got, you're thinking 2 months ahead of construction completion, so that, the agencies are prepared to come out and visit the sites, so that USDA can sign off on 100% completion, and so can the agency. It's been a challenge in COVID because RD wasn't able to travel for a long time. So figuring out, communicating again often with RD and the agencies on how that completion process is going to look. That's extremely important to lay out at the beginning of the construction period, so that you know what the expectations are for getting that construction completion. Placed in service, and that's mostly with the agency, and getting an idea for what their process is. And I have found it very, very helpful to have your first place in service application submitted to the agency, get their global comments on the place in service app, and then, continue on with the rest of your place in service apps as you are, moving through construction and closing out each of the projects in the portfolio. That's everything on that slide. I might pause, see if there's any questions there. Or we might save those for the end. I'm not sure. Robin?
Amy, there was a question about how do you manage portfolio deals if some properties are really weak, like low rents, weak local economy, and do you have to deny the inclusion of some properties and for a portfolio transaction? And how do you kind of assess how you're going to do that?
So on the portfolio, we've got strong properties and weak properties. Strong properties are ones that can leverage a lot of debt and do not require a lot of equity. Weak properties can hardly leverage any debt and take a lot of equity. So we'll have one property priced at 30 cents and another property priced at $2.25. And so the way we structure with the equity investor is that we have, they bring their equity in on the portfolio level, and we divvy out the equity amongst the projects, the weak to the strong, 30 cents to the $2.25. And so that's how, that's kind of how you you aggregate the equity at the portfolio level and divvy it out amongst the projects. There are, when we're underwriting, there are properties that, just don't make it into the portfolio. And those are the ones that are 3 cents because they cannot leverage any equity and, any debt. And, they're just a huge suck on the portfolio because of construction costs and other, items that are in the development budget that just make it too expensive to do that property.
So it really goes back to the benefit of the portfolio transaction and really being able to, you can't have all properties that are in smaller, markets that maybe that can't absorb rent increases. You do have to have a balance of properties that are in stronger markets, but it's certainly the benefit to be able to access funding and resources and investment dollars for those communities that may otherwise never see it. And Amy talked about the way that that's structured from an equity standpoint, but it's, it irregardless to the investor, they're indifferent. They have an equity pricing that they're going to pay. And then we're able to allocate accordingly those resources. And it kind of just goes back to that flexibility of a portfolio. Unfortunately, you can't, the numbers don't, sources and uses don't balance it always in putting every single property in. And so it's a series of, analysis, resources, looking at it, balancing, affirming, validating the assumptions that we've put in place, making sure everybody's comfortable with those assumptions, having those validated from independent third-party reports, and then getting there. But certainly, there have to be the stronger properties that can absorb some of the hit from the weaker properties. So, when we were looking at it, and John put up the screen what the challenges were for those 3 properties, those are challenge properties, but coupled together potentially with other properties within a portfolio, maybe there's a way to pull those along, because without that, they're still continuing to sit on the sidelines and not able to make an impact. Was there any other questions, or do we want to move on to the next one? Maybe we'll keep moving to the next slide. And so one of the things, and Amy's going to kind of go into the details. Amy gets into the details, and this is where she shines. But we talk about this often and with frequency within our shop here at Greystone, and it's the strength of the development team. And what we say is, you'll hear kind of reoccurring themes or points that we make, but it's just because how important it is to us within the process. But every general contractor is not cut out for portfolio transactions, in place rehabs. Every LIHTC attorney that's prolific in 9% development work does not want to handle the volume of a 44 property portfolio closing in one state within a couple of days of each other. And so the strength of the development team and having experience within RD in the 515 space is what we deem as essential partners, and having that level of communication, and understanding, the leaning in and the timelines associated with the transaction and the transparency that Amy's talking about that's required, but, and the strength of the property management group. So we talk about that a lot internally, and those are certainly the deals where, we now have, having done this for over the last 15 years, we have a bevy of development partners that we're comfortable bringing to the table, that we know that can execute market studies. When you order 44 at a time, do they have the resources to be able to get out there and execute on that in a timely fashion, so it doesn't hold up the process? All moving pieces of the puzzle. But we talk about, really kind of assembling the best and the brightest development team that is appropriate for this type of transaction and the process that it's going to need and what we're going to have to go through. And just because someone's a good LIHTC attorney or good GC doesn't necessarily mean that they ultimately want are right suited for this type of transaction.
And I think I'll add to that, there was a joke about, that the portfolio transactions are expensive and everyone has an attorney on the team, but Oftentimes I find the attorney is the most important people to the transaction when we're getting towards a closing. I can't express how important it is to have a real estate attorney that understands RD transfer. They do a lot of work on behalf of the ownership to get the transfer processed and closed. Same goes for the lender. The lending side is very important. The lender counsel is very important at closing. The investor syndicator, can't express how important it is that they understand the rural product as well, especially as you're getting towards closing and finalizing that operating agreement. Just you want to make sure that you've been crystal clear with them on RD and how they underwrite and what the expectations are for each of your equity installments and how you get there, especially your construction completion and your stabilization. Those all kind of intertwine together, and understanding the rural product is very important. General contractor and architect. I think John touched on this and Will did as well. Being a GC in an urban area is a bit different than rural, and finding subcontractors in a rural market oftentimes is hard. You do need a very strong general contractor that can pull resources, so that's an important piece. I think that the investment banker, underwriter, bond issuer, trustee, all those come into play at closing. They become, my first phone call sometimes. That's very important to have somebody that, is experienced. And oftentimes I find it's important that they have experience in the state with which you're working. So that would be a key question I would ask, is make sure that, they have experience in Georgia or Mississippi or Louisiana, I think is the other state. But, making sure that people have experience in the state and experience with USDA is very important. Next slide. Oh, you know what? I made a note to myself. Can we go back to that slide? I also think I find it very valuable on the appraisal side to have an appraiser that is that has worked with USDA as well. A USDA appraisal sometimes can have 15 values that USDA needs. I might be exaggerating, but there are a lot of values that are required for an RD appraisal. And it's very important that your appraiser is well versed and knowledgeable with the USDA product and the values that they're looking for. Same goes for the market analyst. You need somebody that understands that when they go out to the market to go see who your comps are, that they understand the comps and what's comparable to USDA. And oftentimes I haven't. Oftentimes you'll want to talk with your manager and make sure that when you get a market study and appraisal back and you've got the comps, you sit down with the manager and say, is there a property that just didn't show up on the CoStar or the whatever's showing up in the appraisal, to make sure that all the comps are there, so that you're getting the best results in your market study and your appraisal. And also the CNA provider is very important, that they have worked with RD in the past, creating that capital needs assessment, understanding what needs to go into that report is essential to moving through the RD process quickly. If you've got someone that's inexperienced, you could be going back and forth on a CNA multiple times. And I think that, those are really key development team partners I forgot to add to this list. So I just want to make that note. Now we can move on. All right, so now we're talking about the particular portfolio in Georgia. We closed this property in March of 2018, this portfolio in March of 2018, and we closed at our last construction job in May of 2020. So it was a fairly long construction process. I was going to try to look up when we started the process prior to the 2018 date, but I ran out of time just to highlight, the timelines to get into these portfolios. This was a labor of love for the state agency, for the state office. They did a lot of the underwriting and transfer applications in the state office. They didn't divvy them out to their, they typically divvy them out to their, the folks in the field, but they kept them at the state office. So if we go to the next slide. This is a map of where all the properties are. You'll see it's dotted throughout the state of Georgia. It was the portfolio kind of went from the north to the south, east, west. One of the key components here was finding a bond issuer within the state, finding a local issuer that had the ability to really had the capacity to work on this bond issuance. That was a very big component to this, is having an issuer that we found in the state that was, they had a financial analyst and they had a good bond counsel there that was able to help usher them through the process. So that's a key component to these portfolios. The landscape's changed a bit in Georgia since 2018. Process may have changed a bit, but I do, it was the bond issuer was a key component to the success of this transaction back then. Then the next slide. All right, we had 26 projects at the beginning of this. We did consolidate 3 of those so that they became 23 projects post-closing. Oftentimes when we have 2 projects beside each other, we'll consolidate operations. It just makes sense from a management standpoint. 1,300 units. We were in 17 counties, 15 family, 8 senior. This portfolio only had 47% RA. That's pretty low from the perspective of other portfolios we've done. So, when we were first looking at this, I was concerned that the 47% we wouldn't end up with 26 projects, but it ended up being a great portfolio at the end.
And I think that on that piece of it, if you don't have a state tax credit, you're probably going to see portfolios working with that higher percentage of RA. That state tax credit
that's a good point.
Makes a big difference in Georgia.
Yeah, because I think we had 20 million in state credits. So that's a good point. The state credit really did make this portfolio underwrite well. A key component to this is a lot of these projects were at risk, eligible for prepay, means that they were going to pull out of the they were going to come out of their affordability period. So, when you go to your concept meeting and there's 96 assets or 96% of the properties in the portfolio are at risk for prepay, really makes RD's ears perk up because they want to keep their projects in the portfolio, especially with the occupancy with which this portfolio, I believe we're at like 95% occupancy on this portfolio. And then another key point is, we are preserving the affordability at 100% of the units at 60% of AMI for the next 30 years. So really guaranteeing that affordable housing is going to be the benefit of the community for the next 30 years and ensuring that it'll be there. Let's see, and then the next slide. This is all the sources that go into this deal. Total sources is $168 million. We had the tax exempt bond issuance. And then we had 27 million in 538 debt. RD came in and gave us 368,000 in a new 515 loan. And then we assumed $27 million in 515 debt on each of the properties. Federal equity was 33 million, state equity was 20. We have one investor by both the federal and state credits. So I think that was really important to this transaction, that the state and the federal investor were the same. I think it would have been fine had they been separated, but it made the process easier for us because we were only dealing with one set of underwriting, and one group to work with on the equity side. Surplus cash RR in a transfer, oftentimes the reserves transfer with the property, and the replacement reserves, when we're going through the underwriting with RD, we will take the post rehab CNA and size the annual deposit to reserve. And then, there's always going to be a starting balance in the reserve account and then the annual deposit to reserve. And any reserves that we don't need for that initial deposit, we'll pull out and use as a source for construction during rehab. So when we go to closing, $2.4 million of the reserve account goes to the 538 lender, and they hold it in a repair escrow. And as we're moving through construction, we'll draw down on that reserve escrow for construction costs. Investment earnings is the delta between the bond interest and the investment vehicle that we hold the bonds in. So you see at the top, we've got 54 million in bonds. The interest earned on that was 2.2. So that was also used as a source. And then DDF was $412,000. So total sources of 168 million, pretty big deal. So I think that, another key component to this kind of draws back to the portfolio is, when you're going out to the 538 MBS market, $27 million is a lot easier to get than, a $1.3 million loan. So investors and lenders look at that, in a favorable way. $50 million in equity. Well, it's just 33 million on the federal side and 20 on the state. I think, that's very interesting to investors as well. I think that if you took one of these standalone deals, sometimes the equity is only $300,000. So I think, if that deal was standing alone today, it wouldn't work because you wouldn't be able to find an investor that wanted to just invest in that one piece at 400,000. So, and again, that kind of shows the size of the portfolio and, how, the equities of scales really helps out. All right, and then next slide.
Yeah, so just kind of in conclusion and wrap up, we talked about, the mission side and the impact. I think all of us, maybe that's implied, all of us that are on this call today have that and kind of embedded in what we do, and wanting to have meaningful impact across the communities that we serve, especially in the rural markets, because we know oftentimes they are overlooked and investment dollars aren't flowing there, and providing housing and healthcare and education within those markets and the communities is so important. So the portfolio transaction, what we kind of described, is at least one piece of the puzzle, and helping to preserve and provide access to not just housing, but affordable housing. That is one piece of the puzzle that's imperative for people to not only survive but thrive within the communities where they want to live in those markets. If anything that we can say, putting together one of these transactions is all about relationships. You have to be very transparent and throughout the process, and people have to know it's not for the faint of heart. I don't know how to, ups, downs. We say, time kills all deals, but I guess that's all relative, because this is going to take some time, right? And deals do come back to life. You have to assemble a group that's committed to the process and committed to the timelines and can persevere. And you have to have patience and humor throughout the process. So based off of our experience, a little bit of words of wisdom, but also, just some thoughts in conclusion. And certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here, share our experience, and happy to, field questions right now and and even offline in the future about, our experience and what we've done. I think, Amy, to date, we've been active in 12 different states in RD portfolios. And so by no means are we a Georgia expert. We've done 2 large transactions in Georgia, but, the most recent one was in 2018. But again, we're navigating the 9% rounds as much more of a understanding the QAP. There's a little more flexibility in these scattered site transactions, but we've been active in 12 states and what we've done, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here and share our experience today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Will and Amy, and for going through that. And it's overwhelming for me to think about trying to close 26 USDA projects on the same day. So I understand why you probably think about it every night as you fall asleep, Amy, for 3 months, because that seems really, I'm still trying to wrap my head around how you made that work. Lots of questions coming in from the audience. And one question is, what are the pluses and minuses of using 538? And my follow-up question to that might be, like, what percentage of the portfolio transactions that you're doing with RD do you use 538 on?
So I think there is one transaction that we did not use 538 that where Fannie Mae, where there was a Fannie Mae execution, but for the majority of the portfolios, just marrying RD to RD and knowing it just makes a lot of sense. They speak the same language, and they go through the same process, and you can get them all on the same page. And so I think we're continually talking about ways to leverage other resources for debt and bring other options to the table. But at this point, they marry well together, and it just seems to make sense because they speak the same language.
That makes a lot of sense, knowing that, the teams are similar. Patricia has a question. It's how and what were the process and process steps for putting together a good team to do the project? Like, how do you locate the people needed for putting together your project? So I think that part of this question is, like, how do you define the right developer partners? I'm curious about, how do you have multiple GCs when you're doing your construction? Kind of, you talked about east to west and north to south. How do you think about that development team, since it's such a key part of the process? Amy, it's probably a question for you.
It's really interviewing folks. I'll go into a state and I'll look at who's on the appraisal list and who's on the market study list in phase 1. And I'll just start talking to those folks, and I know some of the questions I want to ask them. I'll ask for a sample report. General contractor is very important. Really getting them to buy in on the in-place rehab. Greystone kind of has, our own little trademark way that we know how to execute on an in-place rehab. It's kind of a trade secret, but you really just need your GC to buy in on being able to do the in-place rehab, and then also have the sub base. You can't get a Portland, Oregon contractor to come into Georgia and think that they're going to find the sub base easily. You need someone with experience in the state. So you're really looking for those general contractors that have the bonding capacity, as well as the first phone call into the trades that are easy to find.
Yeah. And I'll just add, I think to be able to find a developer or developer partner, John referenced this of how he was early on, but find a developer partner that has complementary skill sets, whether you're an organization that has real estate development staff, or you're just a one-man show. Like, you need to figure out where your holes are, and then and what your strengths and what your weaknesses are, and then go out and find a partner that makes sense for you. Greystone, the way that we operate, in the RD space, we're a developer. We do things for our own balance sheet, but primarily in the RD 515 space, we're developer partners and capacity builders providing turnkey development services. And it goes back to this is not brain surgery. It's a volume thing. And we have a team here that's been built to be able to service that. But we're not, there are other people within the industry that can do that and have that insight and that knowledge. And so I think you've got to go out and be able to have someone that has some level of experience and expertise. And it's not just in tax credit development work. It's not just in preservation, but it's with RD 515 to understand that and understand what that looks like, knowing that the timelines associated with these transactions are going to be long and wide, that, you know, you're going to have pre-development dollars out for these properties for, you know, 3 years potentially, depending, you know, can you carry that? What, you know, do you need a partner that has, you know, financial strength and capacity, pre-development dollars? How do you approach that and getting the right partner? And I think that's where you start with building out that development team. And then hopefully that person, whoever you select, will also have relationships within that specific market for how you want to approach it.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Well, I think Mavis, that also sort of answers your question too about like how to get started in this. I think that the real key, especially as you're going on, I mean, the portfolio is so complicated, but even as you're just starting development on a smaller scale project, getting a development partner that you really trust and have a good relationship with is really key to getting started. And then one more question is, can you talk a little about the ownership structure of the portfolio overall?
Yeah, typically we work with one group on the ownership piece, and they are going to be the managing member or the GP within the transaction. They oftentimes have their own management company. They're not bringing in third-party management. And then each one, the way that the portfolio is structured is that each deal is separately underwritten and there's no cross collateralization. While there is a portfolio equity pricing, each one has its own separate bucket for debt and equity, but the equity is just dispersed accordingly depending on the way that it needs. So, you know, there's a 0.01% managing member who's oftentimes that long-term owner and operator. Then you've got your 99% investor member or direct investment member, whoever it may be. And then often, and again, the way that we've approached all deals to date with RD 515 is that our partners have wanted to be in the ownership, excuse me, to maintain long-term control of the assets for the foreseeable future. And so the way that we've operated is as a turnkey development partner. So we're not involved in the ownership.
Got it. And one last question, I know we're at or a little bit over time, is if we know of folks who might be wanting to divest of properties, how would they connect with somebody who might be interested in purchasing them? Or do you have any tips on that?
It's a small universe. Is what, you know, RD 515, and there's a lot of, you know, going back to kind of the metrics and the universe of RD 515 properties, that it's really not manageable to own one or two, you know, that, you know, and you've seen a lot of consolidation within the industry just because there are metrics and bumper guards put in place that don't really necessarily encourage, you know, efficiencies in the operations and whatever it may be. And so you'll see some of the owners that are recommitting themselves and doubling down to serving these rural markets and then taking on more properties to manage them, to be able to have some type of economic incentive associated with it. And so I would just say, there's lists of properties out there. I mean, word of mouth, you know, talking to people within the industry or showing up at some of the trade shows and events and conferences, you know, wearing a hat that says I'm a buyer of 515 properties, or talking to me about it. I mean, like there have been some buyer seller conferences where, you know, you wear like a green shirt and a red shirt if you're a buyer or a seller. So a lot of that hasn't been in person or taken place over the, you know, since March of 2020. And so I don't know if some of that might be coming back, but I don't, you know, and then there are oftentimes that we'll see, you know, deals get put through the traditional, you know, investment sales brokerage network. So, you know, it's, you know, I think I don't think there's one source to be able to source that one specific way, but I think.
I think we'll look, I hope we're going to try to do some live buyer to seller conferences in the next year as part of the work that we're doing at Enterprise with TA on 515 housing preservation. And it is going to be good to meet in person. So thank you again so much, Amy and Will, for your time and for conversation. We will be able to share your emails with folks after the session. So if you have further questions for them, let me know, and we'll get that out to you. Also, just want to make sure everybody was called to attention. Adrian put a survey in the chat for this session. Next session, well, is that the next session? The next public session will be June 15th. It'll be in person at the Loudermilk Conference Center. Please make sure you register so that we can make sure everybody has lunch. I'm very excited to see folks in person for the first time since I don't know, think since Will spoke in Texas, I think for Preservation Academy. So very exciting about that. And I'm really thankful for all of your participation so far this year. Looking forward to more continued conversation. Have a great rest of your day, y'all.
Thank you.